to introduce the Peter Karmel Panel Discussion, we're very pleased to have Professor Jeff Harcourt AO here to introduce the panel. Professor Harcourt has an amazing CV, but I will just say he's authored, co-authored, edited 29 different books and 350 articles. He's the Professor Emeritus of History of Economic Theory at the University of Cambridge and the Emeritus Fellow, Jesus College, Cambridge, and the Professor Emeritus at the University of Adelaide. Please welcome Professor Harcourt.
Well, thank you very much. It's a double privilege for me to be here, but first of all, I want to pay to remember the Indigenous people on whose land we're meeting and pay respects to their elders, past and present. I feel privileged in two dimensions today. One is to talk very briefly about my old friend and first boss, Peter Karmel. Secondly, to have the privilege of introducing Laura Tingle, whom I've much admired but only met today. But she knows my son, one of our sons, well. And thirdly, to say a little bit about the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, who are one of the sponsors of this two-day conference. I actually became a fellow of the Academy the first year that the Academy became the Academy and not the Social Science Research Council. And when I got an invitation to it, I went to my great friend and mentor, Eric Russell, and said, "Have you heard of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia?" And he said, "Yes." Well, I said, "Well, they just asked me to join it. What does that entail?" And then I found out. I was, I think, quite young at my first meeting, and I thought it was a gathering of pompous old farts, actually. Not least because they had a very serious discussion on whether they should inaugurate something called the Academy Award. But I've served on the executive committee and on the membership committee, and I think the Academy does a lot of good work and supports the ideals of scholarship in the best sort of way, and helps young people as well as established people, and has brought out some very worthwhile and lasting and helpful research, both to advance ideas and also to advance policy, which as economics is a social science, our ultimate reason for being is to design humane policies to help those who can't help themselves. Now let me say something about Peter Karmel, who was my first boss. Peter was a remarkable man, and I wish he was here today because his PhD at Cambridge, after a brilliant undergraduate degree at Melbourne University, was in demography and on fertility, and so he would be telling you in a very informed way what some of the trends and problems that you'd have to look into. He was innovative and original in his work on demography. Peter had the view that you should change your job every 10 years or so, and that's exactly what he did. He was a child professor at Adelaide, being appointed before he was 30. He was the inaugural Vice-Chancellor of Flinders. He was then put in charge of all the Australian university system, and then he became the Vice-Chancellor of the ANU. On the way, he was an important part of the Vernon Committee. He did a lot for music and the music faculty at the ANU, and in some ways, though it's terribly sad he's dead, I'm glad he's not alive to see what's happened to the music faculty at the ANU. He was a very, very wonderful head of department, and he was a very subtle man. He persuaded every member of the department, until he got a majority for what he wanted, that they were his most intimate and best friend, on whose opinion he could trust. As soon as he got the numbers, he would then move at a democratic faculty meeting that we do such and such, and of course there was a majority for it. The only times that he didn't have time to do something like that, he made a terrible balls up with the decision that he was making. And finally, secondly, one of the things he formulated was Karmel's law. Not only be absolutely great at what you do, but make sure that the person who follows you is a bit of a dud, so you look relatively even better. Finally, I must talk about the wonderful team work that he and Lena had. Lena and Peter were most wonderful, warm-hearted, down-to-earth, tell you how it is people who supported innumerable people, were incredibly generous, and were a loving, supportive family. Everything you would hope that happy families would be. Keith Hancock once said to me that Peter could work for 8 to 10 hours at an intensity most of us could only do for 2 hours, and I think that's true. So he's very close to being a genius. But most of all, he was a great Australian and a great human being, and I count it as one of the greatest privileges of my life to have been his colleague and his friend. Just before he died, Bob Wallace and I took up what was our first book, but his third, Economic Activity on the Economics of Keynes. He was very ill and great pain, but we talked for an hour and a half gossiping about the past, and Lena told me afterwards that was the first time for months and the last time of his life that she ever heard him laughing. So that was a great farewell for Bob and I to take up the reissue of our book, Economic Activity, and the three parents to be photographed proudly holding our baby. Now let me introduce Laura Tingle. I had the great pleasure of listening to her on Philip Adams last night, and I just was struck by her ideal combination of high intelligence, wisdom, which doesn't always go with high intelligence, and a nice understated wit, as well as passion for important things, and, well, as we say now, evidence-based knowledge and presentation. She's been the Australian Financial Review's political editor, reporting politics from Canberra and Press Gallery for almost 30 years, after beginning her career in Sydney, reporting on the financial markets and economics. She's the author of Chasing the Future, a book about the recession of the early 1990s, and a 2012 quarterly essay, Great Expectations, Government, Entitlement and an Angry Nation, which I think is a beautiful backdrop for what we will be discussing today. She's won both Walkley and Lynham Awards, and we're all in her debt for her very wise and laid-back but sensible comments with Fran Kelly and other people, and Philip Adams, and raises greatly the standard of discussion in Australia, which God alone knows it needs. Thank you very much.
Oh, gosh, thanks, Jeff. You can come more often. Good afternoon. I'm not actually going to talk all that much at this point because we're going to keep moving along. But I suppose it's really fascinating for me to be here today and just think about the point that a couple of speakers have made about the way public policy is now morphing, if you like. When I was a very young journalist, academics were the ones who were really driving so many economic debates in particular in this country, and they've sort of, from a journalist's perspective, unfortunately faded a lot from the front line in the last 20 or 30 years. The bureaucracy had a huge role, obviously, but now we're finding that essentially people are having to sort of claim the debate for themselves and say, oh, look, for goodness sake, we're going to have a discussion ourselves about this because it's not getting anywhere, because politics is sort of getting in the way. So we've got an incredibly fortunate occurrence here where we've got some really great public policy experts who've taken it into their own hands. So what's going to happen is each of our panellists is going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to try to lead a discussion that just sort of picks apart some of the arguments and just talks about what the ambitions of the CSRI are straight up, and what some of the arguments are that we should be having over the next 2 days. So first of all, Dr. Vince FitzGerald.
Thank you, Laura. And the only bit of my CV that you need to read is the bit in the conference brochure. I want to talk about the importance of establishing clear retirement income objectives if we're going to get a more coherent approach to reform. It's worth in understanding why it's so important to go back and see where the system came from, a bit of history, and to understand how different that history might have been if the objectives had been much more clearly articulated from the very beginning and guided policy ever since. The history of retirement incomes policy actually starts before federation. The two largest states, Victoria and New South Wales, had age pension systems from the year 1900, before federation. Queensland also introduced an age pension in 1908, at which time the Commonwealth, which had the constitutional power, decided that a national uniform age pension would be a better bet, and it so legislated for an age pension effective from the 1st of July 2009. The Commonwealth age pension, which was subject to a residency requirement, which I think started about 25 years residency in Australia, but was later eased, it was set at the modest level even then of £1 per fortnight per person as a maximum rate, which, doing a quick calculation for inflation and the like, is something like a bit under $4,000 per annum per person in today's dollars, something like that. And it was means tested from the start. So clearly, whatever was said at the time, which I didn't have time to dig out, it was seen as a safety net to ensure that people would not fall into poverty after retirement. The age pension has retained that character ever since, although the form and parameters of the means test, or a combination of income and assets test, has changed quite a number of times and are currently proposed to change again, as we heard from Cassandra. The way the pension is adjusted has also changed a number of times. Initially, adjustments were made at the government's discretion periodically. A form of indexation was first introduced in the 1930s, but then was abandoned as war approached. In the post-war period, of course, indexation has become the norm, and in recent times it's been based on average wage movements, implying that poverty, and thus what income is needed to avoid it, is seen as relative to general community standards. And again, that was a point made by Cassandra. There has been a far more confused history in superannuation policy development. A number of attempts were made in the past to establish something like Andrews or the World Bank's Pillar 1, that is the mandatory national superannuation scheme, although what was being talked about was not always called that. Attempts of that sort were made as early as the 1920s and 30s, but they all elapsed or were never implemented. The first attempt that on my reading of the history that was made to develop a national superannuation scheme of some sort was proposed by the National Superannuation Committee of Inquiry, set up by the Whitlam government in the 1970s, chaired by Keith Hancock. It recommended a partially contributory universal pension system with an earnings-related supplement, something like we have now with the combination of the age pension and super. So what that committee was proposing was a system that for the first time looked in an integrated way at both components, with a safety net but also an element of income maintenance post-retirement. Whatever its merits, though, Hancock's recommendations were rejected by the subsequent Fraser government. It wasn't till the early 1990s that a scheme was introduced with income maintenance as an implied but not very clearly articulated objective, a scheme to apply to the bulk of the workforce, namely the superannuation guarantee scheme we still have. It was, of course, preceded by the achievement of an initial element of occupational superannuation achieved through the centralised wage fixing system funded by employer contributions of 3% of wages and extended award by award throughout the workforce, or through much of the workforce. Of course, in some sectors, the public service, banking and insurance, large companies generally, occupational super schemes had long existed, at least for white-collar or salaried staff. Although it is hard to find a clear expression of how it would serve to achieve an overall retirement income objective, the key driver of the superannuation guarantee reform was very obviously a desire on the part of the labour movement to lift living standards in retirement beyond what the age pension would provide. And to make sure that that was a general factor for the bulk of the workforce, not just the privileged, 40% or thereabouts who had already had occupational superannuation. Along with that expected achievement, a number of other potential achievements of the superannuation guarantee system were also ascribed to it, including lifting national saving. I have a bit of form in that direction, and relieving demography-related and other pressures on future budgets and associated intergenerational equity concern. I hasten to say that I believe that a compulsory superannuation system such as ours, that is contributory and fully funded from the contributions, albeit assisted by significant, if often exaggerated, tax concessions, albeit inequitably distributed, and which operates in conjunction with the age pension system, is in many ways an excellent system. And we, in my opinion, not going to do ourselves a favour by going back to Tours and tearing it all up. When fully mature, this system will, for most people in the workforce, produce something like a first world level of income maintenance in retirement. I personally think that the proposed increase to 12% would have assured that for most middle income earners, and I disagree with Andrew on that. It depends which modelling you look at, and credible modelling on credible assumptions that I look at think that the 9.5% probably isn't enough for that middle income group. Of course, very different considerations apply to those on very high incomes who don't need to have their level of income maintenance at the levels that middle income earners do, and people on low incomes have very different issues. Along the way up to the present, changes to the superannuation and age pension policies have tended to be made separately and generally without adequate consideration of their interactions. Short-term budgetary considerations have been a major driver, and changes have hardly ever been made in pursuit of a clearly articulated retirement income objective, or to have been designed in full conformity with general policy principles such as simplicity, fairness and efficiency. Had that approach, some of the suboptimal decisions, particularly on the superannuation tax structure, might have been avoided. How much of the complexity of the system, the too frequent changes of the rules and the inequitable distribution of the benefit of tax concessions could have been avoided if the recognised best tax structure, taxing entirely on withdrawal from the fund at the end, or the similar in orientation, very good proposal of the Henry report had not been trumped by short-term budgetary considerations. We would have a far simpler and fairer system without the need for as many rules and without the need for the so frequent changes to the tax structure and other rules that we've seen. Importantly, more revenue capacity would have been left to future budgets that will bear the higher costs of providing age pensions, health and aged care to the population, to a population with substantially more old people. So the first moral of this story is that narrowly focused reviews and piecemeal budget-driven decisions on the separate components of the retirement income system, conducted without the guidance of a clear overriding objective for each of those components, have left us with a system of many faults along with its undoubted strengths. The second moral is that future policy development will be more consistent and effective if it is guided by a clear and widely accepted objective and an approach that deals with the overall retirement system in all its components holistically. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm probably going to say quite a lot of what Andrew said and what Vince has said. Certainly I'm going to pick up on where Vince left off. We do need to see our retirement income system as a system. Too often we seem to see age pension as being quite separate from superannuation or vice versa. And in fact, we need to look at them together. That's an important point. The second point is that we need an overall framework for that, and that's what this session's about. I'm going to try and pick out a few critical elements of this framework, but probably the most important is to get agreement on the objectives. And as Vince indicated in the past, and Andrew also indicated, there hasn't really been agreement on the objectives. It's all been a bit fuzzy. And so I guess the encouraging thing is that one can get a sense of consensus already that the critical objective for retirement incomes, I must correct myself, it is retirement incomes, the critical objective is to provide an adequate or comfortable income in retirement. That is the critical objective, and there's a fair amount of consensus developing around that. But in a sense, that when I use the word adequate or comfortable income, what is an adequate or comfortable income? And it will differ for different people according to their previous income. It is a fact that our previous income does define to an important extent what we think is comfortable and adequate when we retire. So I wonder if you can put my first slide up. We, the Committee for Sustainable Retirement Incomes, okay, there we are. Our committee has tried to elaborate a little what we mean by a comfortable or adequate living standard in retirement. And we've got, as was being referred to already, we have two goals in effect which spell that out. The first one is poverty alleviation for those who haven't been able to provide for themselves. And the second one is income maintenance to enable those who can to maintain their previous living standard in retirement. So there's if you like, a base level safety net for those who haven't been able to provide, but then for those who can provide for something more than that, have experienced more than that, that should be that they should be able to get something close to their previous living standard. What does that mean? In reality, it means that superannuation is not primarily there to build wealth or maximise wealth. Now, that maximising wealth might help you to maintain your living standard, but it's not. The objective of superannuation is not to maximise wealth in its own right. Even less is it there is superannuation to be a form of intergenerational tax-sheltered transfer of wealth to your next generation. Neither is a source of infrastructure financing. Now, obviously the superannuation balances may be used for infrastructure financing, but that is not their main purpose, nor should superannuation, and for that reason superannuation should not be directed to infrastructure financing. Indeed, as an aside, I'd say, given the dodgy nature of the vast bulk of infrastructure proposals in Australia, The worst thing that could happen to us superannuants is to have our savings wasted on them. Far better the taxpayer wastes his and her savings on them. And finally, superannuation is not a substitute for the age pension. It can supplement the age pension, and most of the projections show that while the proportion of part pensioners will grow in the future and the proportion of full pensioners will decline, the proportion of people who are getting at least a part age pension plus the full pension won't change going out over the next 40, 50 years. There'll still be about 20% of people who don't get an age pension. They won't go up or down. There are good reasons for this. The cut-out point for the present age pension is below, the cut-out point, just let me get my facts right. The cut-out point for the age pension is, for a married couple, is about 40% below what's of 70% of average weekly earnings. So someone who was used to getting 70% of average weekly earnings would be getting less than the cut-out point for the age pension for the couple. And they'd be getting and the 70% of average weekly earnings is only slightly above the cut-out point for an age pension for a single person. So really, given that the nature of the means test, and the means test is quite tough. I mean, it's 50 cents in the dollar. It's a high tax rate by any standards. But you could only stop people getting superannuation and the pension if you reduce the pension drastically, so it no longer provided poverty alleviation, or you increase the means test drastically, which would be a very steep tax rate. Let me now turn to what's the role of government in this whole system. Well, of course, the principal role of government is financial support, and that's a reason in itself, I think, for limiting the objectives of the retirement income system to focus on retirement income, because the government is heavily supporting financially the retirement income system. The government also has a role in that it mandates self-help through compulsory contributions. That's a very important regulatory role, and also has a very important regulatory role in prudential regulation of superannuation balances. I think the question for the future is, should the government be more active in ensuring that retirees are best able to use their superannuation to maintain their retirement incomes? At the moment, as already being referred to, there is a shortage of products that in financial markets that really enable people to take their lump sum, which is what they've got on the day they retire, to invest that in a way that guarantees their retirement income into the future. And a second issue related to that is whether the government should also mandate that people use their superannuation, which has been heavily tax subsidised, for retirement income purposes and not for other purposes such as bequests. As has been, so if we take these two objectives, how would we measure success in terms of achieving them? Clearly, alleviation of poverty. What does poverty mean in a country like Australia? I think there's a general agreement it's not absolute poverty such as it would be in a very poor country. It's relative to community norms. It's deprivation. It's the fact that you can't enjoy things that other people in your society take for granted. So it's deprivation. It's relative, so it's relative. Poverty alleviation is relative to community norms, and a common measure is 50% of median income. That's a common measure that's used by the OECD. There could be others. On the other hand, income maintenance is relative to the individual's previous income, or the couple's previous income. It's maintenance of their previous living standard. Generally, the view is that 70 to 80% of pre-retirement incomes is sufficient. Remember, this is net of taxation, but it's also because your costs of living are less when your families have grown up, you've paid off your home and so on. The second point in the framework that the committee is proposing is a set of principles. And if we could put... there we go, good. These principles have already been referred to by my colleagues, so I won't go through them in great length. The version here isn't quite the same because it's got an extra one that but it's broadness and adequacy. That's how comprehensive the system is, and these principles, I should say, should be used to evaluate the system, and that's a critical issue going forward. If we can get agreement on the principles, then we can start agreeing. We can test the system as to how well it meets these principles. So it's how comprehensive the system is, how adequate it is in terms of protecting people. It's its fairness and acceptability in those terms. It's robust. This one didn't get up in the previous version. By robust, it should deal appropriately with the risks that superannuants face in terms of investment risk, inflation risk, and longevity risk. Simplicity and certainty, you've heard. Can I just say on certainty, which I think is very important, our system has been indicated, and I think you're all aware, has been subject to continuous tinkering, change. Usually not fundamental change, but it creates a lot of uncertainty, this sort of change. And I'll come back to that in a second. The last principle, sustainability, that's an obvious one. But it's the fact that our system is so subject to change that I think creates the uncertainties. And people, when, let's suppose you retire at 67. You've got, whatever it is, X years to live, 15, 20 years to live. You're really making decisions over quite a long period, and you need to have a degree of confidence that those decisions won't become invalid because of changes to the rules. But as long as the system doesn't meet these principles or criteria, I don't think we can be confident that the system will be robust and that there won't be that degree of certainty. If people perceive it as being unfair, if they perceive it as being unsustainable, if they perceive that the level of incomes being given are inadequate or, on the other hand, too adequate, then the system won't be sustainable. So on that note, I'd like to end. I think it's really important that we get an agreed set of principles to evaluate the system, and then on the basis of that, we might be able to put together a system that would be sustainable and people would be confident would be sustained without constant tinkering. Thank you.
I wanted to pick up from where Mike left off in discussing the constant tinkering in the system, and think about how we move from where we are now to perhaps a better, more conducive policy environment that is more conducive to long-term planning. So in discussing that, I'm going to sidestep all the political issues, because tomorrow we have a great session in the afternoon that will really, with lots of very experts in this area, to discuss the political context for reform. And I'll just mention in passing that we have the former Treasurer, John Dawkins, here today. Welcome, John, and he'll be at that session tomorrow. And so I'm going to sidestep the politics and talk more about the policy environment and how, in order to try and get the certainty, how we might move towards fewer piecemeal changes and basically try and take retirement income policy development out of the budget context and place it within a longer term horizon. So in order to, so what I'll plan to cover is three things. Firstly, I'll reiterate the importance of setting the objectives and principles, and that was certainly something that was put forward by the Murray inquiry that as being an important next step. However, of itself, that probably isn't sufficient, I would say, and then what you then would need is to do something with those objectives and principles. And what we're suggesting is that you need a comprehensive review. And then the third thing that I wanted to discuss was how you engage with the broader community in undertaking that review so that you can garner support for the reform efforts. So I'm going to focus on those last 2 points and just elaborate a little bit on them. I guess most people would wonder why you would need another review, given we've had so many reviews. Although I think Laura will attest to the fact, while we've had a lot of reviews, we haven't actually had a retirement income review since, I think we worked out 1988 with the Cass review. So we've also had the financial system inquiry review, but of course it only looked at the, in this area, it only looked at the retirement income system, and it didn't, the aged pension system, aged care was out of its scope, and that was really something that I think even the panel members thought was a bit of a constraint that they could have lived without. We also had the prospect of a tax white paper, and we hope that superannuation will be part of that tax, fully considered in that context. But even then, it's hard to imagine that the whole pension system would be part of that. And we've have a Treasury retirement review of retirement income stream product. So that's obviously a useful review that's happening. But what those reviews lack, despite all the reviews, there is still the absence of an overarching perspective. And that overarching perspective is really quite important to be able to look across at both the age pension and the tax system, because we've had for so many years, the age pension and the superannuation system, because we've had for so many years this evolution of the pension, the age pension and the superannuation system evolving fairly independently of one another, with very little consideration as to the interactions between the two systems. You could argue that maybe that was okay in the past when the majority of retirees were pensioners, and and therefore they didn't have a foot in each camp. But now, with 80% of retirees being part-rate pensioners, the interaction between the pension system and the social and the age and the superannuation system becomes really quite critical. So what a review would need to look at is to take the agreed principles, objectives and principles, and then apply them to an evaluation of how the system is performing, with a view to identifying where the key problem areas lie, and then, having identified those problem areas, to then develop a roadmap for reform, and most particularly to take into consideration transition paths. I won't go into a lot of detail about, the exact scope of a review, because that will be the subject of, much debate over the next day or so. But clearly there's the need to look at how well the system how well targeted both systems are, the age pension and the superannuation system. There's the need to look at adequacy, particularly adequacy for different groups, including people with interrupted work histories, Indigenous people. So those sorts of things should ideally be looked at. The complexity of the system, obviously, a comprehensive review would allow for consideration of how you can actually try and reduce that complexity. The sustainability of the system, how not just looking at the costs of the tax concessions and the pension, but also taking into account how they fit in with within the broader budget context. And the other important area is the way the system manages longevity risk and the extent to which that could be improved. So moving on to the next part, which was about the engaging with the broader community, there is a real difficulty and a real challenge for a review, and that is to think about how any reform proposals can be made acceptable to the broader community, because I think the comment was made earlier that any changes, people have made their retirement income planning on the basis of the arrangements at the time. So any changes to the system obviously can lead to winners and losers, and can also lead to possibly legitimate claims of retrospectivity. And at the same time, though, if you're going to try to reduce the number of losers in order to get agreement, a broader agreement amongst the community, that then suggests consideration of grandfathering, which then adds to an already complex system. So this is that's quite an issue for a review process going forward. I think the critical take out of all of that is simply waiting on government, or given all of these complexities and the difficulties of getting engagement or getting public support for change, simply waiting on government or the parliament to provide certainty, the certainty that we're looking for, is probably not going to be an effective strategy. And so that's where there's an important role for both industry and community. I would argue, I think we're coming to an agreement that there's an important role for industry and the community to play to try and garner broader support. So that then has implications for how a review might be carried out. Possibly the most preferred model would be an independent committee, similar to the model for the Murray inquiry, where the individuals were selected. Critical to the success would be to appoint individuals on the basis of their on a personal basis rather than on the basis of on a representative basis. The need for a really transparent and consultative process is really quite important. But clearly there is a sensitivity at this point in in the current context, to be announcing another inquiry. So that therefore raises a question, can we wait for government? Is there another option? Is there an option where instead of a government-appointed committee, maybe there's an option where a number of industry groupings and community groupings work together, collaborate to undertake a comprehensive review. So even once you have a review, then there's perhaps even also the consideration of, is that enough? Having articulated the objectives, having had a review, developed a reform program, would that be enough to ensure that the retirement income system isn't subjected to constant tinkering in the budget context? So there would be the question there about whether there's an ongoing stewardship function. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so we've got 15 minutes of power dating on a couple of issues, just to really stretch out some of the points that you've made. I don't know whether many of you have had a chance to read the committee's discussion paper yet, which is very excellent, and it highlights some of these points about sustainability and equity, and redefines these points about poverty alleviation and income maintenance. And what I was going to do is I was just going to roll up about 3 or 4 questions for you to variously chew on en masse. If you believe that we have a basic principle, the basic principles of the system are poverty alleviation and income maintenance, and that we need a coherent policy framework, if you think about the various issues that have been used to discuss this in the past, superannuation was something that was going to help national savings or infrastructure, as people have mentioned. But one of the other ideas that's come and gone over the years is, should there be a notional minimum or maximum value of government support for retirement incomes, which goes across all the various forms of, across all the various pillars of retirement incomes? And also, it doesn't sound from your paper, obviously you're particularly focused at the moment on post-retirement incomes and making sure that there's an efficient product there as an early goal of your deliberations, but is our goal, or is your goal, or is the goal of the debate to change the quantities of self-provision versus, say, universal pension? Do you think there needs to be a change in the actual mix or projected mix of pensions and superannuation, given that we are moving towards this perpetual system of part pensions? And how does this fit with the sort of regularly identified problem of the booming cost of pensions? If we basically think that pensions are basically the right amount, but fewer people will be getting them, what do we actually do about this? And finally, the committee's discussion paper essentially seems to say, well, the ideal tax arrangement for super would be to tax on exit and get rid of the taxes on contributions and earnings, but then says that's just too hard to address. Is it off the table altogether that we should be reconsidering this, given the equity issues that Cassandra has raised and which keep coming up, or and how should we be thinking about that? So I'll leave all of you to just address various bits of those as you see fit in the next 15 minutes. So.
Well, let me make a start on the last one of those. In the National Saving Report that I submitted to the former Treasurer over there 22 years ago, I observed that most... is this actually turned on? It will be, okay. Most OECD countries that have that system of allowing that is those that have a contributory system like Pillar 2 and 3 in the World Bank model, have an EET, exempt tax on exit system, which has many advantages. First of all, the full dollar goes in, not a dollar less some tax rate at the beginning. The full rate of compounding applies so that the earnings grow at the greatest possible rate. And on their circumstances at the time, the rich people would pay a lot of tax because everything that came out would be taxed at full marginal rates. And given the pressures that will be on future budgets, not just demography related, and there are a lot of those, there's the age pension itself, there's the health costs, aged care costs, but there are also technology factors that are driving up the cost of healthcare, for example. And that would leave a lot of taxable capacity to budgets that will really need it. However, most of us think that that there would be a horrendous, decades-long transition process back to that. And there are ways that will achieve much of its objectives. And I commend to you the Henry report of a few years ago, released 5 years ago, today, or May, in the month of May 5 years ago, which proposed a system which gave a much more equal distribution of whatever concession was deemed desirable across all income levels, and which did as little as possible to affect the compounding and so on by having a uniform tax rate of 7.5% instead of the present 15% on earnings right throughout the accumulation and retirement phases. So that had many of the same objectives as EET. So it's possible to do something that's quite practical, doesn't have long transitional problems, that gets many of the same positives.
Right, a couple of the other questions. I'm not sure we're going to remember them all. You can remind us. Look, this fast growth of the age pension might equally say the fast growth or even faster growth of the superannuation tax concession, which is actually faster. But, it's the nature of things that some budget items go up faster than the average and some go up slower than the average. I don't see that. I mean, if you think that it's wrong in its own right, that it's not efficient, then do something about it. If it doesn't represent value for money, do something about it. But if it's giving value for money, and you're confident it's giving value for money, then so be it. I mean, if you want to look at the really fast growth of government expenditure at the moment, it's on national security. And no one's sort of saying, well, this is unsustainable, we better not do it. I think it is important that you look at whether the system's giving value for money and working, but if at the end of the day, it rises faster than the average, and it's because people are getting older, so be it. In my view. Similarly, I don't see myself that you should put a cap on. I'm not sure you said that, but I inferred that you were saying there should be a cap on the total government expenditure on the aged or something like that.
Whether you can define what some sort of level between the various ones.
Okay. Look, well, if we're looking at limits on the amount to individuals, I guess I'm personally attracted to the notion that superannuation should be taxed at your marginal rate less a rebate, and the rebate should be a common rebate across all taxpayers. And that's basically the Henry. Henry went further. He had various other parts which actually finished up costing money. It didn't get any budget savings out of the Henry It actually cost money. I looked it up again just the other day. Anyway, that's it. But, I think, whether you give rebate, if we just had a common rebate, Henry proposed 20%. That seems to me fundamentally fair. The fact that people at higher tax rates will pay more as they do now, that seems to me the way to go, and not to put other limits. Let me also just say on that, at the moment, because a combination of the system being tax concessions being unfair, and perhaps the cost of them, governments have introduced things like reasonable benefit limits, which they then got rid of. Then they put caps on how much you can put in. Now that, to me, is the need for these things like reasonable benefits limits and caps is fundamentally because the system hasn't been fair and potentially unsustainable too. And it's been used for tax sheltering and savings and so on. Whereas if the system were fair, that everybody got a common rebate, then I'm not sure that you'd need these caps and reasonable benefit limits.
Just add a couple of points. I'm very much in where Mike's coming from on this. I think if we got the system a little bit more balanced, I don't think we're going to get an EET system, but I think we could redesign our TTE system to be nearer to, in its effect, to an EET. That would make some savings. But the most important shift would be to ensure that that's actually being used for retirement income purposes. And that seems to me the most important. If you did that, what would happen about this mix? The mix wouldn't radically different from what we've got now, but it would be slightly different. You would find some reduction in pension outlays. You wouldn't have quite as accelerating tax expenditures, but overall, people would be relying more on their own savings than on the pension. But the balance would not shift dramatically. I think Mike's right that you may get some change, further change between full-rate pensioners and part-rate pensioners, and you may, in fact, have some reduction in the total getting some pension, but not by much. I think that balance will be not a major change.
I was going to address... Okay. I was just going to address, Laura, your comment about whether there ought to be a notional level of income support. And I guess another way, clearly it's important to look at the tax concessions and how they're targeted. But complementary to that would be to how you define your income maintenance objective, because the income maintenance objective could be defined in an absolute sense, or it could be defined in a relative sense as in terms of replacement rate. So, if you were looking at it in an absolute sense, you could set a comfortable income level as being, appropriate, and perhaps try and design the support arrangements, both the age pension and the tax, to kind of make sure that everyone at least meets that. But beyond that, you're on your own. And, that's the approach.
Well, I suppose if the easiest vehicle, or the one that sort of captures a lot of these various issues, is trying to make as efficient as possible post-retirement incomes. I mean, obviously you've identified the need for annuities or some sort of product to give, to address longevity risk, to make sure that people are using their retirement incomes. What else do we need to do in that post-retirement phase, do you think, to start channeling and making as efficient as possible people's savings as a form of retirement income?
Well, the Murray Committee recommended that a comprehensive income product for retirement, CIPR, be introduced, and it would be designed as something that the industry could develop, and there'd be various competing versions of it, no doubt, which would endeavour, by its design, to have at least an element of insurance against longevity risk. And the hope was expressed that it could become a default option for taking your money out of super in the future when that was developed. That's one suggestion that sort of at least starts the process in that direction. It's very difficult to imagine that you could mandate the channeling of all the money that comes out of super into, say, a lifetime annuity product, when there are all the problems of the pricing of those products, the lack of the assets to build them on, the adverse selection that the providers would face, and so on. So that is something that's fraught with difficulties, even though it's worth exploring whether some of those difficulties can be overcome. There's also the problem that even though people are overdoing it in insuring against longevity risk in their own way, usually by as was said before, spending less out of their super than they could. And my mother was who didn't have super, only the age pension, but she was a saver till her 93rd birthday, and she died soon after that. And a lot of old people are like that. They hate the idea of running out of money, and they are very parsimonious in their spending compared to what might be possible if they could manage this longevity risk in a different way. But you're impinging a lot on people's freedom if you mandate one particular way of managing that longevity risk. So there are quite a lot of difficult issues there. But nevertheless, it's obviously a very major area and will become more and more important as more and more people retire with superannuation.
If I can make a couple of points, I think there are two issues that need to be teased out. One is how strongly we press through regulation or mandating the use of longevity protection products. How far do you take that? And I think there are different views on that in the community we need to tease out. One of the arguments for going further in that route is that in fact you may, by having much more common that people do it, that you will address adverse selection and things of that sort because everybody's in the pie. The second issue is a related one, and that is how flexible should our system be in being able to suit what each one of us want versus giving people a bit more certainty and clarity as to what the system's doing. It's all very well to say everybody should have the chance to design it around themselves, but if that means that we're expecting people to manage risks, understand a very complex system, then there are limits to that. So that balancing between flexibility and certainty, I think, is something we need to think about as well.
Okay, well, thank you for your thoughts on all of those things. I'm being told to stick to time, so we're going to try to do that. But it seems a really good point from which to start the conversation tomorrow, which just happens to be about managing longevity risk. What a coincidence. So thank you, everybody, and please thank our panellists.